Arthur Orton, who claimed to be Sir Roger Charles Doughty Tichborne, BART, by Anonymous. The case of Arthur Orton is too recent to need many words of introduction. We have hardly yet cooled down to a sober realization of the facts which, as they stand, mark the latest and most bulky of the claimants, as not only the greatest impostor of modern or perhaps of any days, the base calumniator who endeavoured to rob a woman of her fair fame to gratify his own selfish ends, but as a living proof of the height to which the blind credulity of the public will now and again elevate itself. Arthur Orton is in prison undergoing what all thinking men must admit to be a very lenient sentence, a sentence which in no way meets the justice of the case, for the advent of this huge carcase lumbering the earth with lies was nothing less than a misfortune to the people of England, and the word misfortune, if used even in its highest and widest sense, will in no way imply that which has happened to a peaceful family, who have been associated with their lands and titles as long as our history goes back, and who have had their privacy violated and the sanctity of their homes invaded, who have been pilloried before a ruthless and unsympathizing mob, who have had their women's names banded from one coarse mouth to another, and who, least misfortune of all, have had to expend large sums of money and 256 great amounts of time and trouble to free themselves from a persecution as unparalleled as it was vicious and cruel. Those who, having neither fame nor fortune to lose, speak lightly and think not at all of the sorrows which were launched avalanche-like upon the devoted heads of the Tichbornes and their connections, would do well to ponder over what such personation as that of Arthur Orton means to its immediate victims. It means a sudden derangement of all the ties and sympathies by which life is made dear, a sudden shock which never in life will be recovered. There is no member of the community, no matter how well and how carefully he has chosen his path in life, who would not fear to have his every action published and criticized, his every motive analyzed unfairly, and the most mischievous construction placed upon each deed or thought found capable of perversion. How much more terrible would it be, then, for any man to know that his wife or mother was to be subjected to such ordeal, that for no fault committed, for nothing but the delectation of an unscrupulous scoundrel and his admirers, a tender and sensitive lady was to be put to torture far worse than any physical punishment could ever have been, even in ages and countries whose only refinement was that of cruelty. Arthur Orton is in prison, but there are still many who loudly assert their belief in his identity with the lost Sir Roger. There are others who are quite as strong in their avowals of doubt as to the name found for the huge mystery being the correct one, and there are again others who, caring little who or what the man may be, affect to credit many of his most villainous utterances. But do these people in their blind impetuosity ever give the merits of the case one thought? Do they remember that Orton was detected in his every lie, and found as heinously guilty as man can be detected and found guilty, when the evidence against him admits of but circumstantial proof? They do not, and like the man who constantly avers that the earth is flat, and his congeners who deny the existence of a being who is apparent in every one of his marvellous works, the believers in Orton must 257 be placed in the catalogue of those who, either of malice prepense or from mental affliction, take the wrong view of a subject as naturally as sparks fly upwards. If the man now in prison is Sir Roger Tichborne, then trial by jury, the selection of our judges and the whole basis of our legal system, indeed of almost every system by which calm and peaceful government is maintained, and the right of the subject duly regarded, must be radically wrong, and right is wrong also. If he is not Arthur Orton, then there never was an Arthur Orton, and Wapping is a place which has no existence out of the annals of the Tichborne trial. The baronetcy of Tichborne, now Doughty Tichborne, is not only old of itself, and connected with vast estates, but is held by a family well known in the history of this country, even as far as that history goes. No parvenu, whose rank is the result of success in cheesemongering or kindred pursuit, is the holder of the title. For, as Debret tells us, the family of Tichborne was of great importance in Hampshire before the Conquest, and derives its name from the river Itchen, at the head of which it had estates. Hence it was called de Itchenborne, since corrupted into Tichborne. Sir John de Tichborne, Knight, Sheriff of Southampton, on hearing of the death of Queen Elizabeth, immediately repaired to Winchester, and there proclaimed King James VI of Scotland as King of England. In 1621 he was created a baronet, the honour of knighthood having been previously conferred upon 3 of his sons, while his 4th son Henry was subsequently knighted. Sir Henry, the 3rd baronet, hazarded his life in defence of Charles I, in several enterprises, and his estates were sequestrated by the parliamentarians. After the Restoration he was successively lieutenant of the New Forest, and lieutenant of ordnance. Other Tichbornes have been sufficiently prominent in their times to leave marks on the history of the country, and altogether riches and honours seemed, until comparatively recently, to be the unshadowed lot of the head of the family. That, however, large estates and long descent do not always secure perfect happiness, has been very 258 well shown in the great trial just past, in many ways perfectly independent of the actual result, or of any question as to whether or not the claimant was he whom he professed to be. Family differences and unpleasantnesses seem to have been the actual, even if remote, cause of the great imposition of Arthur Orton. Had matters been conducted as one might have anticipated they would among people blessed with the means of gratifying every whim and caprice, Roger Tichborne would have lived and died like other men, and his name would never have been known except as a quiet country gentleman of English origin and French tastes, which led him into more or less eccentricities, and caused him to be more or less popular among his neighbours and dependents. But this was not to be. All great families have their secret unpleasantnesses, and in these the Tichbornes were by no means behindhand. The Tichbornes generally had a knack of disagreeing, and this feeling was shown in excelsis by James, the father of Roger and his wife, who lived abroad for many years, she being French in every sentiment, while the husband was but naturalized, and now and again exhibited a desire to return to his native land. When Roger was born, there was but little chance of his ever becoming the owner of either titles or estates, and so his education was entirely foreign, his tutors being 1,000 chatelain and a priest named Lefevre. As time wore on, it became evident that Mr. James Tichborne would in due course become Sir James, and he felt it his duty to secure to his son an English education. This the mother opposed most strenuously, and it was only by artifice that the boy was brought to England. Sir Henry Joseph Tichborne, who had succeeded to the baronetcy in 1821, had no son, and though time after time a child was born to him, Providence blessed him with no male heir. Again and again a child would be born at Tichborne, but it was always a girl. Sir Henry had 7 children, of whom 6 lived, all celebrated for their good looks and their tall and handsome proportions, but all were daughters. 259 still there was Sir Henry's brother, Edward Tichborne, who had taken large estates under the will of a Miss Doughty, which led to the present junction of the Doughty and Tichborne properties, and to the double surname, and with them had assumed the name of that lady, and he was after Sir Henry the next heir. Edward had a son and daughter, but one day there came the news to James and his wife in France that Sir Edward's little boy had died, and then it was that the father perceived more clearly the error that he had made in permitting Roger to grow up ignorant of English habits and the English tongue. Edward Doughty was an old man. His brother James Tichborne himself was growing in years. The prospect of Roger one day becoming the head of the old house of Tichborne, which had once been so remote, had now become almost a certainty. It would not do for the Lord of Tichborne to be a Frenchman. Sooner or later he must learn English, and receive an education fitting him to take the position which now appeared in store for him. All this was clear enough to Mr. James, but not so clear to his weak-headed and prejudiced wife. The father did indeed obtain her consent to take the boy over to England, and let him see his uncle and aunt, the Doughtys, at Upton, in Dorsetshire, and his uncle, Sir Henry, at the ancestral home down in Hampshire. But Roger was then but a child, and as he grew older Mrs. Tichborne became more than ever resolute in her determination that, come what might, her darling should be a Frenchman. What cared she for the old Hampshire traditions? France was to her the only land worth living in. A Frenchman's life was the only life worthy of the name. Her dear Roger might succeed to the title and estates, but she could not bear the thought of his going to England. It was in her imagination a land of cold bleak rains and unwholesome fogs, but it was worse. It was the country of a people who had been false to their ancient faith. Even the Tichbornes, though still Catholics, had not always been true to their religion. And so Mrs. Tichborne planned out for the future heir of Tichborne a life of perpetual absenteeism. He should 260 marry into some distinguished family in France or Italy, and little short of a princess should share his fortunes. If he went into the army it should be in some foreign service, but in no case should he go to Tichborne, or set foot in England again if she could help it. James Tichborne was like many other weak men who have self-willed wives. He put off the inevitable day as long as he could, but finally achieved his purpose by strategy. Roger was in his 17th year when the news arrived that Sir Henry had died. It was right that James Tichborne should be present at his brother's funeral, and reasonable that he should take with him the heir, as everyone regarded him to be. Accordingly, Roger took leave of his mother under solemn injunctions to return quickly, but there was no intention of allowing him to return. The boy attended the funeral of his uncle at the old chapel at Tichborne, went to his grandfather's place at Noyle, and thence, by the advice of relations and friends, and with the consent of the boy himself, he was taken down to the Jesuit college at Stonyhurst, and there placed in the seminary with the class of students known as philosophers. When Mrs. Tichborne learnt that this step had been completed, her fury knew no bounds. Roger wrote her kind and filial letters in French, ill-spelt it is true, but admirably worded, and testifying an amount of good sense which promised well for his manhood. But Mrs. Tichborne gave no reply, and for 12 months the son, though longing ardently for a letter, got no token of affection. Yet Mrs. Tichborne was not the person to see her son removed from her control without an effort. She upbraided her husband violently, and there was a renewal of the old scenes in the Tichborne household. But Roger was now far away, and the danger of Mr. Tichborne's yielding in a momentary fit of weakness was at an end. Meanwhile the mother wrote violent letters to the heads of the college, exposing family troubles in a way which called forth a remonstrance from even the lad himself. What was the precise nature of his studies at Stonyhurst, and what progress he made in them, are questions that have been much debated. But 261, it is certain that he applied himself resolutely to the study of English, and made such progress that, although he could never speak it with so much purity and command of words, as when conversing in his mother tongue, he learnt to write it with only occasional errors in spelling and construction. In Latin he made some little progress, and in mathematics more. He attended voluntary classes on chemistry, and his letters evidence an inclination for the study both of science and polite literature. At Stonyhurst Roger may be said to have passed the 3 happiest years of his life. During the period just mentioned, the then last of the Tichbornes made many friends, and if he did not become what we understand as accomplished, he was refined and sensitive. During the vacations he used to visit his English relatives in turn, but there was one place above all others to which he preferred to go. This was the house at Tichborne, then in possession of his father's brother Sir Edward Doughty. There was a certain amount of delicacy in his position towards his uncle and his aunt Lady Doughty, which cannot but be intelligible to anyone who has the least knowledge of human failings. It is not in the nature of things that either Lady Doughty or her husband could have been greatly predisposed towards the youthful stranger, and Roger was shy and reserved and oversensitive. He had the misfortune to stand in the place which they must once have ardently hoped that their dead child would have lived to inherit. Sir Edward was in failing health, and his brother James was an old man. The time could not therefore be far distant when this youth, with his foreign habits and his strong French accent, would take possession of Tichborne Park with all the ancient lands. More than that, he would come into absolute possession of the new Doughty property, including the beautiful residence of Upton, near Poole in Dorsetshire, for which Sir Edward and his family had so strong an affection. It was through Sir Edward alone that this property had been acquired, but the lady who had bequeathed it to him had no notion of founding a second family. In time all the lands and houses in 262 various countries bequeathed by her, as well as those which were purchased by trustees under her will, were to go to swell the Tichborne estate, and to increase the grandeur and renown of the old house. Upton was the favourite home of the Doughtys. Sir Edward, who had been in the West Indies, had returned thence with his black servant named Andrew Bogle, then a boy, and had married, he and his wife doubtless for a long time looking on Upton as their home for life. It cost them a pang to remove even to the house at Tichborne. It was at Upton that their only surviving child Kate had spent her early years, and to return there and enjoy the fresh sea breezes in the summer holidays was always a fresh source of delight. It was hard to think that even Upton must pass from them, and that the day was probably not far distant when there would be nothing left for them but to yield up their home and estates to the newcomer, and retire even upon a widow's handsome jointure and the fortune of Miss Kate. But if such feelings ever passed through the minds of the family at Tichborne, they could have been only transient. The shy, pale-faced boy with the long dark locks came always to Tichborne in his holidays, making his way steadily in the favour of that household, and this not from interested motives on the part of Lady Doughty, as has been falsely alleged and triumphantly disproved, but clearly from something in the nature of the youth which disarmed ill feeling. Roger, despite his early training abroad, soon showed good sound English tastes. He took delight in country life, and though he did not bring down the partridges in the woods or throw the fly upon the surface of the Itchen with a degree of skill that would command much respect in the county of Hants, he did his best and really liked the outdoor life. In hunting he took delight from the time when he donned his first scarlet coat, and he rarely missed an opportunity of appearing at the meet in that neighbourhood. The time soon came when Roger had to think of a profession, and James Tichborne again gave mortal offence to his wife by determining that the young man 263 should go into the army. Among the daughters of Sir Henry was one who had married Colonel William Greenwood of the Grenadier Guards. Their house at Brookwood was but half an hour's ride from Tichborne, and Roger was fond of visiting there. Colonel Greenwood's brother George was also in the army, and he took kindly to Roger and determined to do his best to get him on. So he took him one morning to the Horse Guards and introduced him to the Commander-in-Chief, who promised him a commission. There was a little delay in keeping this promise, and the young man did not go troubling uncles again, but took the self-reliant course of writing direct to the Horse Guards to remind the Commander-in-Chief of what he had said. And before long Mr. Roger Charles Tichborne was gazetted a cornet in the 6th Dragoons, better known as the Carabineers. He passed his examination at Sandhurst satisfactorily and went straight over to Dublin to join his regiment. From Dublin he went to the south of Ireland, and twice he came over to England on short visits. He went through the painful ordeal of practical joking which awaited every young officer in those days, and came out of it, not without annoyance and an occasional display of resentment, yet in a way which conciliated his brother officers. And few men were more liked in the regiment than Roger Tichborne, affectionately nicknamed among them Tish. In 1852 the Carabineers came over to England and were quartered at Canterbury. They expected then to be sent to India, but the order was countermanded, and Roger saw himself doomed apparently to a life of inaction. There is a letter of Roger's among the mass of correspondence which he kept up at this period of his life, in which he notices the fact that his mother still dwelt upon her old idea of providing him with a wife in the shape of one of those Italian princesses of which he had heard so much, and with whom he had always been threatened. But Roger was by this time in love with his cousin, and his love was by no means happy. Roger had been for years visiting at Tichborne before he had ever seen his cousin Kate there. He had 264 met her long before when he came over as a child from Paris on a visit, but Miss Doughty was too young at that time to have retained much impression of the little dark-haired French boy, who could hardly have said "Good morning, cousin," in her native tongue. When Roger was 20 years of age, they met for a few days at Bath, where both had come on the melancholy duty of taking leave of Mr. Seymour, then lying dangerously ill and near his death. Then they parted again. Roger went to Tichborne for a long stay, but Miss Doughty returned to school at the convent at Taunton. In the midsummer holidays, however, they once more met at the house in Hampshire, and for 6 weeks the young cousins saw each other daily. Then Miss Doughty went away to Scotland with her parents, and the youth took upon himself the pleasant duty of going to see the party take their departure from St. Catherine's Wharf. October found the party again assembled at Tichborne Park, and there Roger took farewell of uncle, aunt and cousin to go to Ireland and join his regiment, and Miss Doughty, whose school days were not yet ended, went down to a convent at Newhall in Essex. When Roger got a short leave of absence, his first thought was to visit his uncle and aunt, who had so affectionate a regard for him. There was a summer visit to Upton in Dorsetshire for a week, when Miss Doughty happened to be there, and there was a visit to Tichborne in January 1850, when there were great festivities, for Roger then attained his majority. Again the cousins took farewell, and met no more for 18 months. No wonder Roger loved Tichborne with all its associations. In that well-ordered and affectionate household, he found a tranquillity and happiness to which he had been a stranger in his own home. In his correspondence with his father and mother at this time, there were no lack of tokens of a loving son. But no one was more sensible than Roger of the miseries of that life, which he had led up to the day when he came away to pursue his studies at the Jesuit College, and to learn to be an Englishman. But there was another association, 265 long unsuspected, yet growing steadily, until it absorbed all his thoughts, and gave to that neighbourhood a glory and a light invisible to other eyes. Roger had spent many happy hours with his cousin. She had grown in those few years from a girl almost into a woman, and he had come to love her deeply. To her he said not a word, to Sir Edward he dared not speak, but one day Roger took an opportunity of confiding to Lady Doughty the new secret of his life. His aunt did not discourage the idea, but Miss Doughty was still but a girl of 15, and there was the grave objection that the twain were first cousins. And besides, though Roger was of a kind and considerate disposition, truthful, honourable and scrupulous in points of duty, he had certain habits which assumed serious proportions in the mind of a lady so strict in notions of propriety. He had in Paris acquired a habit of smoking immoderately. In the regiment he had been compelled, by evil customs then prevailing, to go through a novitiate in the matter of imbibing military port. And his habits had followed him to Tichborne, and the young officer had been seen at least on one occasion in a state of semi-intoxication. No less a word will describe his condition. He was also accustomed to bring in his portmanteau French novels, which were decidedly objectionable, though few young men would probably regard it as much sin to read them. So little did the young man appreciate her objections to this exciting kind of literature, that he had actually recommended to his aunt some stories which no amount of humour and cleverness could prevent that pious lady regarding as debasing and absolutely immoral. How Lady Doughty felt under all the circumstances of Roger's love, as compared with his general conduct, will be best shown by the following letter. 1850, Tichborne Park, begun 29 Jan, finished 31st. Catherine Doughty. Roger protested that his failings had been exaggerated, and by his letters it is noticeable there is a trace of vexation that Lady Doughty should have lent an ear to coloured reports of his manner of life. But there is no abatement in the affectionate terms on which he stood with his aunt at Tichborne. Matters, however, could not long go on in this fashion. As yet Roger Tichborne had never spoken of his love to Miss Doughty, though it cannot be doubted that some tokens had revealed that secret. But love must find expression in something more than hints and tokens, and at last came the inevitable time. It was on Christmas Eve, 1851, that Roger joyfully set foot in Tichborne Park once more. That was a happy meeting in all, but the fact that Sir Edward Doughty was in weak health. Now comes the denouement. Miss Doughty had given Roger a keepsake volume of Father Faber's hymns, and there was an exchange of gifts. Suddenly the truth flashed across the mind of the father, and he was vexed and angry. On a Sunday morning, when the two cousins had been walking in the garden enjoying the bright winter day, and they were sitting together at breakfast, a message came that Sir Edward desired to see his nephew in the library. The girl waited, but Roger did not come back to the breakfast table. The eyes of the cousins met sorrowfully in the chapel, and in the afternoon, with Lady Doughty's permission, they saw each other in the drawing-room to take farewell, for Sir Edward's fiat had gone forth. Marriage between first cousins was forbidden by the Church, and there were other reasons why he was resolute that this engagement should be broken off before it grew more serious. So it was arranged that on the very next morning the young man should leave the house forever. Thus the great hope of Roger's life was suddenly extinguished, and there was nothing left for him but to sail 268 with his regiment for India, and endeavour, if he could, to forget the past. Some days after that, at his cousin's request, he wrote out for her a narrative of his sorrows at this time, in which he said, "What I felt when I left my uncle it is difficult for me to explain. I was like thunderstruck. I came back to my room and tried to pack up my things, but was obliged to give up the attempt as my mind was quite absent. I sank on a chair and remained there, my head buried between my two knees for more than half an hour. What was the nature of my thoughts, my dearest Kay, you may easily imagine. To think that I was obliged to leave you the next day, not to see you again, not perhaps for years if ever I came back from India. The idea was breaking my heart. It passed on, giving me no relief until about 2 o'clock, when my aunt told me that you wished to see me. That news gave me more pleasure than I could express, so much so that I never could have expected it. The evening that I saw you, my dear Kay, about 5 o'clock, you cannot conceive what pleasure it gave me. I saw you felt my going away, so I determined to tell you everything I felt towards you. What I told you it is not necessary to repeat, as I suppose you remember it. When I came away from the drawing-room my mind was so much oppressed that it was impossible to think of going to bed. I stopped up until 2 o'clock in the morning. I do not think it necessary, my dearest Kay, to tire you with all the details of what I have felt for you during these 2 days. Suffice it to say that I never felt more acute pain, especially during the night when I could not sleep. I promise to my own dearest Kate on my word and honour that I will be back in England, if she is not married or engaged, towards the end of the autumn of 1854, or the month of January 1855. If she is so engaged, I shall remain in India for 10 or 15 years, and shall wish for her happiness, which I shall be too happy to promote." Neither Roger nor Kate had, however, given up hope of some change. Lady Doughty, despite a secret dread of her nephew's habits, had a strong regard for him, and 269 would be certain to plead his cause. And in a very few days circumstances unexpectedly favoured his suit. Sir Edward's malady grew worse, the physicians despaired, and he believed himself near his end. Roger was sent for hurriedly to take farewell of his uncle. As he approached the sick bed his uncle said, "I know, my dear Roger, the mutual attachment which exists between you and your cousin. If you were not so near related I should not object at all to a marriage between you two. But however, wait 3 years. Then, if the attachment still exists between you and you can get your father's consent, and also leave from the church, it will be the will of God, and I will not object to it any longer." To which Roger replied, "Ever since I have had the pleasure of knowing you and my cousin, I have always tried to act towards you two in the most honourable way I possibly could. The Church, as you know, grants dispensations on these occasions. Of course, if you approve of it, I will get my father's consent, and also leave from the Church, and do it in an honourable way in the eyes of God and of the world." These two speeches seem rather stilted and unnatural, yet this is how they have been given in evidence. Days passed, and Roger sat up night after night with his uncle. It was during those tedious watchings that he again wrote at Miss Doughty's request a narrative of his feelings, which ran thus: Tichborne Park, Feb. 4, 1852 1, A 1000. What I have suffered last night I cannot easily explain. You do not know, my own dearest Kay, what are my feelings towards you. You cannot conceive how much I loved you. It breaks my heart, my own dearest Kay, to think how long I shall be without seeing you. I do feel that more than I can tell you. You have the comfort of a home, and moreover, at some time or other, 271 some person to whom you can speak, and who will comfort you. I have none. I am thrown on the world quite alone, without a friend, nothing. But however, I shall try and take courage, and I hope that when you will see me in 3 years you will find a change for the better. I shall employ these 3 years to reform my conduct, and become all that you wish to see me. I shall never, my own, my dearest Kay, forget the few moments I have spent with you, but on the contrary, I shall only consider them as the happiest of my life. You cannot imagine how much pleasure your letter has given me. It proved to me, far beyond any possible doubt, what are your feelings towards me. I did not, it is true, require that proof to know how you felt for me. It is for that reason that I thank you most sincerely for that proof of confidence, by expressing yourself so kindly and openly to me. You may rest assured, my own dearest Kay, that nothing in this world will prevent me, except death in actual service, from coming back from India at the time I have named to you, the latter part of the autumn of 1854, or the beginning of 1855. It will be a great comfort for me, my own dearest Kay, when I shall be in India, to think of you. It will be, I may say, the only pleasure I shall have to think of the first person I ever loved. You may rest assured that nothing in the world will make me change. Moreover, if you wish me to come back sooner, only write to me, and I shall not remain 5 minutes in the army more than I can help. I shall always be happy to comply with your wishes, and come back as soon as possible. Again rest assured, my dearest Kay, that if in any situation of life I can be of help or service to you, I shall only be too happy, my dearest Kay, to serve and oblige you. Your very affectionate cousin, R. 100, Tichborne. Roger went back to his regiment in Ireland soon after the date given in the foregoing extract, but the Carabineers were finally removed to Canterbury, and in the summer he again got leave of absence, which he spent with his aunt and cousin in London, and at Tichborne. 272, and it was on the 22nd of June 1852, that the young people walked together for the last time in the garden of Tichborne House. They talked of the future hopefully, and for her comfort he told her a secret. Some months before that time he had made a vow and written out and signed it solemnly. It was in these words: I make on this day a promise, that if I marry my cousin Kate Doughty this year, or before 3 years are over at the latest, to build a church or chapel at Tichborne to the Holy Virgin, in thanksgiving for the protection which she has showed us in praying God that our wishes might be fulfilled. Roger went back to his regiment, and indulged his habitual melancholy. To his great regret, the order for the Carabineers to go to India had been countermanded, but he had no intention of leading the dull round of barrack life in Canterbury. He had determined to go abroad for 1.5 years or 2 years. By that time, the allotted period of trial would be near an end. He had determined to leave a profession which offered no outlet for his energies. The tame round of the cities and picture galleries of Europe had no charms for him. Among the many books which he had read at this time were the Indian romances of Chateaubriand, René, Attila, and Le Dernier Abencerrage. How deeply these stories had impressed his mind is apparent in his letters to Lady Doughty. Happy, he says, was the life of René. He knew how to take his troubles with courage, and keep them to himself. Retired from all his friends to be more at liberty to think about his sorrows and misfortunes, and bury them in himself. I admire that man for his courage, that is, the courage to carry those sorrows to the grave which drove him into solitude. Among his intimate friends and schoolfellows at Stonyhurst was Mr. Edward Waterton, whose father, the celebrated naturalist, had given to the college a collection of stuffed foreign birds and other preserved animals. And there can be no doubt that the famous narratives of adventure in South America of that distinguished traveller were among the books which Roger and other college friends read at that period. How deeply the splendours 273 of the Natural History collection of Stonyhurst had impressed the mind of the boy is evidenced in the fact that Roger took delight at school in practicing the art of preserving birds and other animals. While long afterwards, in humble emulation of the great naturalist's achievement, he gathered and sent home, when on his travels, many a specimen of birds of splendid plumage. South America, in short, had long been the subject of his dreams, and now in travelling in that vast continent, he would try to find occupation for the mind, and get through the long time of waiting which he had undertaken to bear patiently. His scheme was to spend a 12-month in Chile, Guayaquil, and Peru, seeing not only wild scenes but famous cities, thence to visit Mexico, and so by way of the United States find his way back to England. Having taken this resolution, he set about putting his affairs in order, for Roger was a man of business-like habits, and by no means prone to neglect his worldly interests. He made his will, saying, however, as he remarked in one of his letters, nothing about the church or chapel at Tichborne, which he said he would only build under the conditions mentioned in a paper which he had left in the hands of his dearest and most trusted friend, Mr. Gosford, the steward of the family estates. In truth, months before the day when he gave Miss Doughty a copy of the vow in the garden at Tichborne, he had solemnly signed and sealed up a compact with his own conscience, and deposited it with other precious mementos of that time in his friend's safe-keeping. Parting with friends in England cost him perhaps but little sorrow, for his mind was full of projects to be carried into effect on his return. He aspired to the character of a traveller, and to be qualified for membership at the Travellers' Club, where in one of his letters while abroad, he requests that his name may be inscribed as a candidate. He had an old habit of keeping diaries, and he promised to send extracts, and after all the time would not be long. There was one house in which Roger naturally shrank from saying farewell. He had made a solemn resolution that he would go to Tichborne no more while matters remained thus, 274, and his pride was wounded by what appeared to him to be a want of confidence on the part of Lady Doughty. In a worldly point of view, it is difficult to conceive any union more desirable than that of the two cousins, but it is clear that the mother trembled for the future of her child. Hence she still gave ready ear to tales of the wild life of the regiment, and hinted them in her letters to her nephew in a way that made him angry but not vindictive. He was asked to go and see his uncle, Sir Edward, before starting, but his will was inflexible, and he went away, as he had all along said that he would, resolved to bury his sorrows within himself. Roger went away in February and spent nearly 3 weeks in Paris with his parents and some old friends of his early days. His mother was much averse to his plan of travelling, and she opposed it both by her own upbraidings and by the persuasion of spiritual advisers who had influence over her son. But it was of no avail. Roger had chosen to sail in a French vessel from Havre, La Pauline, and sail he would. His voyage to Valparaiso was to last 4 months, and thence he was going on in the same vessel to Peru. It was doubtless because of the strong hold which the French language and many French manners still had on him, that though he took an English servant with him, he preferred a French ship with a French captain and French seamen. On the 1st of March 1853, he sailed away from Europe, and, as we are bound to believe, never returned. The Pauline started with bad weather which detained her in the Channel, and compelled her to put in at Falmouth, but after that she made a good voyage round Cape Horn to Valparaiso, where she arrived on the 19th of June. As the vessel was to remain there a month, Roger, after spending a week in Valparaiso, started with his servant John Moore to see Santiago, the capital of Chile, about 90 miles inland. Thence he returned and sailed for Peru, where he embarked for places in the north. At Santiago his servant had been taken ill, and though recovering was unfitted to travel. His master thereupon furnished him with funds to set up a store, and took another servant, 275, with whom he underwent many adventures. At Lima he visited the celebrated churches, and purchased souvenirs for his friends and relatives. Having stored a little yacht with provisions, he started with his servant on a voyage of about 300 miles up the river Guayaquil, and was for some days under the line. He made similar journeys in a canoe with his servant and 2 Indians, still bent on collecting and preserving rare birds of gorgeous plumage. He also visited and explored silver and copper mines. During all this travelling he continued his home correspondence with great regularity, but the first news he received was bad. Scarcely had the Pauline left sight of our shores, when Sir Edward Doughty died, and Roger's father and mother were now Sir James and Lady Tichborne. By and by the wanderer began to retrace his steps, came back to Valparaiso, and with his last new servant, Jules Beraut, rode thence in one night 90 miles to Santiago again. Again he started with muleteers and servants on the difficult and perilous journey over the Cordilleras, and thence across the Pampas to Buenos Aires, Montevideo and Rio de Janeiro. In April 1854, There was in the harbour of Rio a vessel which hailed from Liverpool, and was called the Bella. She was about to sail for Kingston, Jamaica, and it was to Kingston that Roger had directed his letters and remittances to be forwarded, that being a convenient resting place on his journey to Mexico, where he intended to spend a few months. The Bella was a full-rigged ship of nearly 500 tons burden, clipper-built and almost new. Aboard this ship, then taking in her cargo of coffee and logwood, came one April morning a young English gentleman who introduced himself as Mr. Tichborne. He was dressed in a half-tourist, half-nautical costume, and wanted a passage to Kingston. Travelling with servants, hiring yachts and canoes, buying paintings, curiosities and natural history specimens, had proved more expensive than he expected. His funds were exhausted, nor could his purse be replenished until he got to Kingston, where letters of credit were expected to be waiting for him. It was some little time before the Captain 276 believed the young man's story, but when he did, he not only undertook to convey him and his people to Kingston, he determined to help him in a matter of some delicacy and not a little danger. For when the vessel was near sailing, Roger was found to be without that indispensable requisite, a passport. Great excitement then prevailed in Brazil on the subject of runaway slaves. Black slaves had escaped by making themselves stowaways. Half-caste people, relying on their comparative fairness of skin, had openly taken passage as seamen or even passengers, and thus got away from a hateful life of bondage. Hence the peremptory regulation that no captain should sail with a stranger aboard without an official license. Under these circumstances a plan was devised by the captain. When the government officers came aboard, no Tichborne or other stranger was visible. As the vessel, loosened from her moorings, was slowly drifting down the harbour in the morning, the officers sat at a little table on deck, smoked and drank with the captain. At length the moment came to call their boat and take farewell, wishing the good ship Bella and her valuable freight a pleasant voyage. Scarcely had they departed when the table was removed, and just beneath where they had been sitting a circular plug closing the entrance to what is known as the lazarette was lifted, and out came Roger laughing at the success of their harmless device. Before noon, the Bella had passed from the harbour of Rio into the open ocean, and was soon on her voyage northward. That was on the 20th of April 1854, and that is the last ever known in good sooth of the Bella. Except as a foundered vessel, 6 days after she had left the port of Rio, a ship traversing her path found tokens of a wreck, straw bedding such as men lay on deck in hot latitudes, a water cask, a chest of drawers, and among other things a long boat floating bottom upwards, and bearing on her stern the ominous words Bella, Liverpool. These were brought into Rio, and forthwith the Brazilian authorities caused steam vessels to go out and scour the seas in quest of survivors, but none were seen. That the 277 Bella had foundered there was little room to doubt, though the articles found were chiefly such as would have been on her deck. Even the items of cabin furniture were known to have been placed on deck to make way for merchandise, with which she was heavily laden. The night before these articles were found had been gusty, but there had been nothing like a storm. When time went by and brought no tidings, Captain Oates, a great friend of the captain of the Bella, who had been instrumental in getting Roger on board, came with other practical seamen to the conclusion that she had been caught in a squall, that her cargo of coffee had shifted, and that hence, unable to right herself, the Bella had gone down in deep water, giving but little warning to those on board. In a few months this sorrowful news was brought to Tichborne, where there was of course great mourning. One by one the heirs of the old house were disappearing, and now it seemed that all the hopes of the family must be centred in Alfred, then a boy of 15. So at least felt Sir James Tichborne. He had inquiries made in America and elsewhere. For a time there was a faint hope that some aboard the Bella had escaped, and had perhaps been rescued. But months went by, and still there was no sign. The letters of news that poor Roger had so anxiously asked to be directed to him at the post office, Kingston, Jamaica, remained there till the paper grew faded. The banker's bill, which was wanted to pay the passage money, lay at the agent's, but neither the captain nor his passenger of the Bella came to claim it. Weeks and months rolled on. The annual allowance of 1,000 a year, which was Roger's by right, was paid into Glyn and Coast Bank, but no draft upon it was ever more presented at their counters. The diligent correspondent ceased to correspond. At Lloyd's the unfortunate vessel was finally written down upon the loss book. The insurance was paid to the owners, and in time the Bella faded away from the memories of all but those who had lost friends or relatives in her. Lady Tichborne was always full of hope that her son had been saved, and could never be brought 278 to regard him as drowned. But we have now seen the last of the real Roger Tichborne, and our next business will be with the counterfeit. At last, in the neighbourhood in which Sir James and his wife lived, it became notorious that the mother was prepared to receive anyone kindly who professed to have news of her son. And naturally, when the story once got wind, there were many who tried to profit by her credulity. Among other adventurers, a tramp in the dress of a sailor found his way to Tichborne, and having poured into the willing ears of the poor mother a wild story about some of the survivors of the Bella being picked up off the coast of Brazil and carried to Melbourne, was forthwith regaled and rewarded. There is a freemasonry among beggars which sufficiently explains the fact that very soon the appearance of ragged sailors in Tichborne Park became common. Sailors with one leg, and sailors with one arm, loud-voiced, blustering seamen, and seamen whose troubles had subdued their tones to a plaintive key, all found their way to the back door of the great house. Every one of them had heard something about the Bella's crew being picked up, and could tell more on that subject than all the owners or underwriters or shipping registers in the world. And poor Lady Tichborne believed, as is evidenced by a letter of hers written in 1857, only 3 years after the shipwreck, to a gentleman in Melbourne, imploring him to make inquiries for her son in that part of the world. Sir James, however, though no less sorrowful, had no faith, and he made short work of tramping sailors who came to impose on the poor lady with their unsubstantial legends. But Sir James died in 1862. Shortly before this event, his only surviving son Alfred had married Teresa, a daughter of the 11th Lord Arundel of Wardour. This, however, did not prevent the mother, in one of her crazy moods, taking a step calculated to induce some impostor to come forward and claim to be the rightful heir, which was the insertion of an advertisement in the Times, offering a reward for the discovery of her eldest son, and giving a number of 279 particulars with regard to his birth, parentage, age, date and place of shipwreck, name of vessel, and other matters. She also incorporated in her advertisement the stories of the tramping sailors about his having been picked up and carried to Melbourne, and this mischievous advertisement was published in various languages, and doubtless copied in the South American and Australian newspapers. This is the first step we find towards the formation of the imposture. Time rolled on, and no Roger, true or false, made his appearance. One day the Dowager happened to see in a newspaper a mention of the fact that there was in Sydney a man named Cubitt, who kept what he called a missing friend's office. To Cubitt accordingly she wrote a long rambling letter, in which, among other tokens of her state of mind, she gave a grossly incorrect account of her son's appearance, and even of his age. But Cubitt was to insert her long advertisement in the Australian papers, and he was promised a handsome reward. Cubitt, in reply, amused the poor lady with vague reports of her son being found in the capacity of a private soldier in New Zealand, and as there was war there at that time, the poor lady wrote back in an agony of terror to entreat that he might be bought out of the regiment. Mr. Cubitt soon perceived the singular person he had to deal with, and his letters from that time were largely occupied with requests for money for services which had no existence out of the letters. At last came more definite information. A Mr. Gibbs, an attorney at the little town of Wagga Wagga, 200 miles inland from Sydney, had, he said, found the real Roger living in a humble station of life, and under an assumed name. Again money was wanted. Then Gibbs, apparently determined to steal a march on Cubitt, wrote directly to the credulous lady, and there was much correspondence between them. At first there were some little difficulties. The man who, after a certain amount of coyness, had pleaded guilty to being the long-lost heir, still held aloof in a strange way, concealed his present name and occupation, and instead of going home at once, preferred to 280 bargain for his return through the medium of an attorney and the keeper of a missing friend's office. All this, however, did not shake the faith of Lady Tichborne. Then he gave accounts of himself which did not in the least tally with the facts of Roger's life. He said he was born in Dorsetshire, whereas Roger was born in Paris. He accounted for being an illiterate man by saying that he had suffered greatly in childhood from St. Vitus's dance, which had interfered with his studies. My son, says Lady Tichborne in reply, never had St. Vitus's dance. When asked if he had not been in the army, he replied, yes, but that he did not know much about it, because he had merely enlisted as a private soldier in the 66th Blues, and had been bought off by his father after only 13 days' service. What ship did you leave Europe in? Inquired Mr. Gibbs, with a view of sending further tokens of identity to the Dowager. To this inquiry Roger Tichborne might have been expected to answer in La Pauline, but, as was shown in the trial, this mysterious person replied in the Jessie Miller. And when did she sail? On the 28th of November 1852, was the reply, whereas Roger sailed on the 1st of March 1853. Asked as to where he was educated, the long-lost heir replied, at a school in Southampton, where Roger never was at school, But it happened that Lady Tichborne, in a letter to Mr. Gibbs, had said that her son was for 3 years at the Jesuit College of Stonyhurst in Lancashire. Mr. Gibbs accordingly suggested to the client, in a humble station of life, that his memory was at fault on that point, but the client maintained his ground. Did she say he had been at Stonyhurst College? If so, it was false. And he added with an oath, I have a good mind never to go near her again for telling such a story. Yet this strange person was able to confirm the entire story of the tramping sailors. He had embarked in the Bella. He had been picked up at sea with other survivors in a boat off the coast of Brazil, and it was quite true that he was landed with them in Melbourne. In short, he corroborated the Dowager's long advertisement in every 281 particular. But beyond that he had nothing of the slightest importance to tell which was not absurdly incorrect. His replies, however, were forwarded to the Lady Tichborne, with pressing requests to send £200, then £250, and finally £400, to enable the lost heir to pay his debts, an indispensable condition of his leaving the colony. It is evident that the statements thus reported puzzled the poor lady a little, and she seems to have been unable to account for the lost heir sending his kind remembrance to his grandpa, because Roger's paternal grandfather died before he was born, and his grandfather by the mother's side had also died several years before Roger left England, as the young man knew well enough. She was clearly a little surprised to hear that the resuscitated Roger did not understand a word of French, for my son, she says, was born in Paris, and spoke French better than English. But yet, with the strange pertinacity which causes people to cling to that which they know to be wrong, and try to force themselves into belief of its truth, she believed in the bona fides of the claimant for maternal solicitude and the paternal acres. I fancied, she said in one letter to Gibbs, that the photographies you sent me are like him, but of course after 13 years' absence there must have been some difference in the shape, as Roger was very slim. But, she added, I suppose all those large clothes would make him appear bigger than he is. Again, alluding to the photographies, she remarks that at least the hand in the portrait is small, and adds, that peculiar thing has done a good deal with me to make me recognize him. A year and a half was consumed in these tedious hagglings with brokers and agents for the restoration of a lost heir, and during great part of that time the lost heir himself made no sign, but contented himself with begging trifling loans of Gibbs on the strength of his pretensions. Sometimes £1 was the modest request, sometimes more. He had married, and a child was born, and on that occasion he implored for £3, plaintively declaring that he was more like a Manic than a B of BK, supposed to mean a baronet of British kingdom, 282 to have a child born in such a hovel. Still, the new man wrapped himself in impenetrable secrecy. The Dowager Lady Tichborne complained that while pressed to send everybody money, she was not even allowed to know the whereabouts nor present name of her lost Roger, and she entreated piteously to be allowed to communicate more directly. It was nothing to her that the accounts the pretender had given of Roger's life were wrong in every particular, except where her own advertisement had furnished information. I think she said on this point, my poor dear Roger confuses everything in his head just as in a dream, and I believe him to be my son, though his statements differ from mine. In the midst of this curious correspondence trouble, once more entered the old home at Tichborne. Sir Alfred, the younger brother of Roger, was dead, and the poor half-crazed mother in a solitary lodging in her loved Paris was left more than ever desolate. Widowed and childless, she had nothing now but to brood over her sorrows, and cling to the old dream of the miraculous saving of her eldest born, who, since the terrible hour of shipwreck, now 12 years past, had given no real token of existence. The position of affairs at Tichborne was remarkable, for though there were hopes of an heir to Tichborne, Sir Alfred had left no child. Should the child, unborn but already fatherless, prove to be a girl or other mischance befall, there was an end of the old race of Tichborne. The property would then go to collaterals, and the baronetcy must become extinct. It was under the weight of these new sorrows that the Dowager Lady Tichborne wrote pitiable letters to Gibbs, promising money and asking for more particulars, while enclosing at the same time to the man who thus so unaccountably kept himself aloof a letter beginning, My dear and beloved Roger, I hope you will not refuse to come back to your poor afflicted mother. I have had the great misfortune to lose your poor dear father, and lately I have lost my beloved son Alfred. I am now alone in this world of sorrow, and I hope you will take that into consideration, and come back. It is hardly surprising that during this time Mr. 283 Gibbs was constantly urging his mysterious client to relinquish his disguise. Why not write to the mother and mention some facts known only to those two which would at once convince her? True, he had already mentioned facts, which turned out to be fictions, and yet the Dowager's faith was unabated. Mr. Gibbs's client was therefore justified in his answer that he did not think it needful. But Gibbs was pressing, for it happened that the dowager had in one of her letters said, "I shall expect an answer from him. As I know his handwriting, I shall know at once whether it is him." Accordingly, we find the claimant, under the direction of Mr. Gibbs, penning this. Wagga Wagga, Jan. 1766. The half-sheet is torn off at this point, but it has been stated by Lady Tichborne's solicitor, who saw it when complete, that the ending originally contained the words, "How's Grandma?" This must have again puzzled the dowager, for Roger had no grandma living when he went away. The date, 22d April 54, was also incorrect, for the Bella sailed on April 20th, but there were other difficulties. Lady Tichborne had never seen and, what is more, had never heard of any brown mark on her son Roger. She could say nothing about the card case at Brighton, which referred, according to Mr. Gibbs, to the claimant's assertion that he had left England in consequence of having been swindled out of £1,500 by Johnny and Harry Broome, prize fighters, and others at Brighton races. And lastly, the anxious mother could not recognise the handwriting. The Australian correspondent was somewhat disappointed that the mother did not at once acknowledge him as her son. But the dowager soon declared her unabated faith, sent small sums and then larger, and finally made up her mind to forward the £400. Meanwhile she sent to him, as well as to her other Australian correspondents, much family information. Among other things she told him that there was a man named Guilful at Sydney, who had been gardener for many years at Upton and Tichborne, and another man in the same town named Andrew Bogle, a black man, who had been in the service of Sir Edward. Mr. Gibbs's client lost no time in finding out both these persons, and soon became pretty well primed. It was shortly after this period that it became known in Victoria and New South Wales that there was a man named Thomas Castro, living in Wagga Wagga as a journeyman slaughterman and butcher, who was going to England to lay claim to the baronetcy and estates of Tichborne. From the letters and other facts, it is manifest that it was originally intended to keep all this secret even from the dowager. He wishes, says his attorney, Mr. Gibbs, that his present identity should be totally 285 disconnected from his future. It happened that one Cater, a Wagga Wagga friend of the claimant, whose letters show him to have been a coarse-minded and illiterate man, was leaving for England shortly before the time that Castro had determined to embark. Whether invited or not, Cater was not unlikely to favour his friend with a visit in the new and flourishing condition which appeared to await him in that country. Perhaps to make a virtue of necessity, Castro gave to Cater a sealed envelope, bearing outside the words, "To be open when at sea," and inside a note which ran as follows. Wagga Wagga, April 2nd, 1866. All this secrecy, however, was soon given up as impracticable, for articles in the Melbourne, Wagga Wagga and Sydney journals quickly brought the news to England, and finally Castro determined to take with him his wife and family. One of his earliest steps was to take into his service the old black man Bogle, and pay the passage money both of himself and his son to Europe with him. Certain relics of Upton and of Tichborne which the claimant forwarded to a banker at Wagga Wagga from whom he was trying to obtain advances were described by the claimant himself as brought over by "my uncle Valet, who is now living with me." The bankers, however, were cautious, and declined to make loans. Nevertheless, the claimant had the good fortune to convince a Mr. Long, who was in Sydney, and had seen Roger, when a boy of 10 years old, riding in Tichborne Park, and accordingly this gentleman advanced him a considerable sum. Finally the claimant embarked 286 aboard the Rakia, on his way to France via Panama, and accompanied by his family, and attended by old Bogle, his son, and a youthful secretary, left Sydney on September 2d, 1866, and was expected by the dowager in Paris within 2 months from that date. But nearly 4 months elapsed, and there were no tidings. Between Christmas Day and New Year's Eve of 1866, there arrived in Alresford a mysterious stranger, who put up at the Swan Hotel in that little town, and said that his name was Taylor. He was a man of bulk and eccentric attire. He wrapped himself in large greatcoats, muffled his neck and chin in thick shawls, and wore a cap with a peak of unusual dimensions, which, when it was pulled down, covered a considerable portion of his features. The stranger, at first very reserved, soon showed signs of coming out of his shell. He sent for Ruse, the landlord, and had a chat with him, in the course of which he asked Ruse to take him the next day for a drive round the neighbourhood of Tichborne. Ruse complied, and the innkeeper, chatting all the way on local matters, showed his guest Tichborne village, Tichborne Park and house, the church, the mill, the village of Cheriton, and all else that was worth seeing in that neighbourhood. In fact, Mr. Taylor became very friendly with Ruse, invited him to drink in his room, and then confided to him an important secret, which, however, was by this time no secret at all, for Mr. Roos had just observed upon his guest's portmanteau the initials R100. T. Indeed, it was already suspected in the smoking room of the Swan that the enormous stranger was the long-expected heir. Suspicion became certainty when the stranger telegraphed for Bogle, and that faithful black, once familiar in the streets of Alresford, suddenly made his appearance there, began reconnoitring the house at Tichborne, contrived to get inside the old home, to learn that it had been let by the trustees of the infant baronet to a gentleman named Lushington, and to examine carefully the position of the old and new pictures hanging on the walls. This done, the stranger and his black attendant disappeared as suddenly as they had come, but the news spread 287 abroad, and reached many persons who were interested. Roger's numerous aunts, uncles and cousins heard of the sudden appearance of the long-expected Australian claimant. The dowager in Paris, the mother of the infant then at Ryde, all heard the news, and finally Mr. Gosford, Roger's dearest and most intimate friend and confidant then in North Wales, got intelligence, and hastened to London to ascertain if the joyful news could be true. But the enormous individual had vanished again. The circumstance was strange. Bogle had written letters from Australia declaring that this was the identical gentleman he had known years before as Mr. Roger Tichborne when a visitor at Sir Edward's, and the dowager had declared herself satisfied. But why did the long-lost Roger hold aloof? No one could tell. There was no reason for such conduct, and so suspicion was engendered. With infinite pains Mr. Gosford and a gentleman connected with the Tichborne family ascertained that the person who had figured as Mr. Taylor at the Swan had taken apartments for himself and his family at a hotel near Manchester Square, and that he had even been there since Christmas Day. But once more the clue was lost. Sir Roger Tichborne had gone away with his wife and children, and left no one there but Bogle and his secretary. Then by chance Mr. Gosford discovered that Sir Roger was staying at the Clarendon Hotel, Gravesend. Forthwith Mr. Gosford, with the gentleman referred to, and Mr. Cullington, the solicitor, went to the Clarendon Hotel at Gravesend, where after long waiting in the hall they saw a stout person muffled, and wearing a peaked cap over the eyes, who, having glanced at the party suspiciously, rushed past them, hurried upstairs and locked himself in a room. In vain the party sent up cards. In vain they followed and tapped at the door. The stout person would not open, and the party descended to the coffee-room, where soon afterwards they received a mysterious note, concluding, "Pardon me, gentlemen, but I did not wish anyone to know where I was staying with my family, and was much annoyed to see you all here." Lady Tichborne herself had failed to recognise in the 288 letters from Wagga Wagga the handwriting of her son, and Mr. Gosford was equally unsuccessful. The party therefore left the house after warning the landlord that he had for a guest an impostor and a rogue. Still the idea that his old friend, who had made him his executor and the depositary of his most secret wishes, could have come back again alive however changed, was too pleasing to be abandoned by Mr. Gosford, even on such evidence. Accordingly, by arrangement with an attorney named Holmes, he went down again, and, more successful this time, had conversation with the stranger who called himself Roger. But nothing about the features of the man brought back to him any recollection, and subsequent interviews but confirmed the first impression. Meanwhile Lady Tichborne had learned that he whom she called Roger had arrived in England, and she wrote letters imploring him to come to her, to which the claimant, who had not been in London more than a fortnight, answered that he was prevented by circumstances, and added, "Oh, do come over and see me at once." On the very day after the date of this letter, however, he arrived in Paris, accompanied by a man whose acquaintance he had made in a billiard-room, and by Mr. Holmes, the attorney to whom his casual acquaintance had introduced him. The party put up at an hotel in the Rue St-Honor. They knew Lady Tichborne's address in the Place de la Madeleine, scarcely 5 minutes' walk from their hotel, but they had arrived somewhat late, and Sir Roger paid no visit to his mother that day. Lady Tichborne had in the meantime consulted her brother and others on the subject, but though the opinions given by them were adverse to the claims of the impostor, she only became more fixed in her ideas. Early the morning after the claimant's arrival, she sent her Irish servant John Coyne to the hotel in the Rue St-Honor with a pressing message, but was told that Sir Roger was not well. His mistress, dissatisfied with that message, sent him again, whereupon Sir Roger came out of his bedroom and walked past him, slowly and with his head down, bidding him at the same time 289 go, and tell his mamma that he was not able to come to her, and his mistress, still more dissatisfied, then directed her servant to take a cab immediately and fetch her son. Coyne then went a third time and found Sir Roger with his attorney and his casual acquaintance sitting at breakfast, but was again unsuccessful. Lady Tichborne that afternoon went herself to the hotel, and was then permitted to see her son in a darkened chamber, and in the presence of his attorney and friend. Sir Roger, said Coyne, who tells the story, was lying on the bed with his back turned to us and his face to the wall, and he added that while he was in that position, his mistress leaned over and kissed Sir Roger on the mouth, observing at the same time that he looked like his father, though his ears were like his uncle's. Then Sir Roger, having remarked that he was nearly stifled, Lady Tichborne directed Coyne to take off her son's coat and undo his braces, which duties the faithful domestic accomplished with some difficulty, while at the same time he managed to pull him over as well as he could. Upon this Mr. Holmes, solemnly standing up, addressed John Coyne in the words, "You are a witness that Lady Tichborne recognizes her son," and John Coyne having replied, "And so are you," the ceremony of recognition was complete. Soon after this it was rumoured in the neighbourhood of Alresford that the Dowager Lady Tichborne had acknowledged the stranger as her lost son Roger, that she had determined to allow the repentant wanderer £1,000 a year, and that he was going to take a house at Croydon, pending his entering into the possession of the Tichborne estates. There happened then to be living in Alresford a gentleman named Hopkins. He had been solicitor to the Tichborne family, but they had long ceased to employ him. He had also been a trustee of the Doughty estates, but had been compelled to resign that position, at which he had expressed much chagrin. Hopkins had an acquaintance named Baynett at Winchester, an eccentric person of an inquisitive turn. Both these began at this time to busy themselves greatly 290 in the matter of the Tichborne claimant, who, on his next visit to Alresford, was accordingly invited to stay at Mr. Hopkins's house. From that time, Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Baynett became active partisans of the claimant's cause. Hopkins had not been the solicitor of Roger Tichborne, but he had seen him occasionally from 15 to 20 years previously, and he made an affidavit that, though he could not recall the expression of Roger Tichborne's features, he had no doubt, from the knowledge which the claimant had shown of the neighbourhood of Tichborne and of family matters, that he was the same person. All Alresford may in fact be said to have been converted. The bells were rung on the claimant's arrival there, and Colonel Lushington, the tenant of Tichborne House, invited the Australian stranger and his wife to stay with him there. Colonel Lushington had never seen Roger Tichborne, but he has explained that he was impressed by his visitor's knowledge of the old pictures on the walls, which, it will be remembered, Bogle had been sent by Mr. Taylor to reconnoitre. When the news came that Sir Roger's wife, on a visit with her husband to Carl Lushington, had had a child baptised in the chapel at Tichborne, while Mr. Anthony Biddulph, another convert and a remote connection of the Tichborne family, had become godfather, the bells of Alresford rang louder, and nobody seemed for a moment to doubt the right of the claimant to the estates and title. Still it was felt strange that Sir Roger went near none of his old friends. He had left Paris without an effort to see his former circle of acquaintances. Chatelain, his early tutor, had been brought by the Dowager there to see him, but Chatelain had said, "Madame, this is not your son." Neither the Absales, nor Roger's dear old instructor, Father Lefevre, nor Garcine, the faithful valet who had played with him from childhood, and had known him well as a man, nor, indeed, any person in Paris who had been acquainted with Roger Tichborne, received a visit. In England the facts were the same. The stranger would go nowhere, and at last it began to be believed that he was afraid of detection. Active measures were meanwhile in preparation for those legal proceedings, which have, within the past 3 years, occupied so large a share of public attention. Mr. Holmes and many others were busy in procuring information. The voluminous will of Roger Tichborne, setting forth a mass of particulars about the family property, was examined at Doctors' Commons. Then there were records of proceedings in the probate court and in chancery relating to the Tichborne estates, of which copies were procured. The Horse Guards furnished the indefatigable attorney with minute and precise statements of the movements of the carabineers during Roger Tichborne's service, and of the dates of every leave of absence and return. Then the Dowager's attorney procured from Stonyhurst lists of the professors and officials during Roger's 3 years' study there. And finally, the books of Lloyd's and the Merchant Seamen's Register were searched for information about the movements of the Pauline, the Bella, and other vessels. Coincident with these researches, there was a marked improvement in the claimant's knowledge of the circumstances of what he alleged to be his own past life. There was no mention now of the 66th Blues, or of having been a private soldier, no denial with or without an oath of having been at Stonyhurst, no allusion to any other of the numerous statements he had made to Mr. Gibbs on those points. Then converts began to multiply, but not among the Tichborne family, or in any other circle that had known Roger very intimately. Affidavits, however, increased in number. People related wonderful instances of things the claimant reminded them of, and which had happened in the past. On the one hand, these facts were regarded as genuine efforts of memory. On the other, they were stigmatized as the result of an organized system of extracting information from one person and playing it off upon another. At the end of July 1867, there was a public examination of the claimant in Chancery, at which, for the first time, he made generally known that famous account of 292, his alleged wreck, and escape in one of the boats of the Bella, with 8 other persons, which with some variations he has since maintained. It was then that, in answer to questions, he stated that he was not certain of the name of the vessel that picked him up, but was under the impression that it was the Osprey. He also said that her captain's name was Owen Lewis or Lewis Owen, but he was not certain, though he said that 3 months elapsed between the date of his being saved and his being landed in Melbourne in July 1854. Besides these, the most remarkable points in his examination were his statements that, on the very next day after his arrival, he was engaged by a Mr. William Foster, of Boysdale, an extensive farmer in Gippsland, to look after cattle, and that he henceforward lived in obscurity in Australia under the name of Thomas Castro. The name of Thomas Castro, he added, had occurred to him because, during his travels in South America, he had known a person so named at Melipilla in Chile. Mr. Garsford was also examined on that occasion, with results which had an important influence on the progress of the great cause célèbre. Some time before that gentleman had been induced to have one more interview with the claimant in the presence of 2 of his most influential supporters, who thereupon requested Mr. Garsford to test their protégé by asking him about some private matter between him and his friend Roger in the past. Thus challenged, Mr. Garsford naturally bethought him of the sealed paper, in which Roger had recorded his intention of building a chapel or church at Tichborne, and dedicating it to the Virgin, in the event of his marrying his cousin within 3 years. And he therefore requested the claimant to declare, if he could, what were the contents of a certain packet marked private, which Roger left in his hands when he went away. Having obtained no definite answer, Mr. Garsford, for the sake of fairness, went a step further, and said that it recorded an intention to carry out an arrangement at Tichborne in the event of his marrying a certain lady. Still there was no answer, and thereupon Mr. Garsford, declaring that the whole 293 interview was idle, left the place. That packet unfortunately was no longer in existence. Some years after Roger Tichborne's death appeared to be beyond all doubt, Mr. Garsford had simply burnt it, regarding it as a document which it would be useless, and which he had no right to keep, and yet one which, on the other hand, he should not be justified in giving up to any living person. The fact of its being burnt he had for obvious reasons concealed, but being now asked on the subject he was compelled to state the circumstance. It is remarkable that, on the very morrow of that disclosure, the claimant for the first time made a statement to his supporter, Mr. Bulpett, as to the packet. It may be supposed that Mr. Bulpett and the claimant's friends generally were inclined to draw unfavourable inferences from his apparent ignorance of the contents of the packet. He now, however, declared that not ignorance of its contents, but delicacy and forbearance towards Mrs. Ratcliffe, had alone prevented his answering Mr. Garsford's test question. Mr. Garsford, he said, was right. It did relate to an arrangement to be carried out at Tichborne, but an arrangement of a very painful kind. Then it was that he wrote out the terrible charge against the lady whom Roger had loved so well, confessing, it is true, his own diabolical wickedness, but at the same time casting upon her the cruelest of imputations. This, he said, was what he had sealed up and given to Mr. Garsford. Mr. Bulpett, the banker, put his initials solemnly to the document, and within a few months all Hampshire had whispered the wicked story. It is to be observed that, during all this time, no word had been spoken by the claimant of his having confided to Mr. Garsford a vow to build a church. 4 years later, when under examination, he was asked whether he had ever left any other private document with Mr. Garsford, and he answered, "I think not." Then it was that counsel produced the copy of the vow to build the church in Roger Tichborne's hand, which he had fortunately given to his cousin on the sorrowful day of their last parting. And finally there was found and read aloud the letter of Roger Tichborne to 294 Mr. Garsford, dated January 17, 1852, in which occur the precious words, "I have written out my will and left it with Mr. Slaughter. The only thing which I have left out is about the church, which I will only build under the circumstances which I have left with you in writing. Happily, these facts render it unnecessary to enter upon the question whether this story was not wholly irreconcilable, both with itself and with the ascertained dates and facts in Roger Tichborne's career. The estates of Tichborne were not likely to be left undefended either by the trustees or by the family, who, with the exception of the Dowager Lady Tichborne, had with one accord pronounced the claimant an impostor. Accordingly, very soon after his arrival in England, a gentleman named Mackenzie was dispatched to Australia to make inquiries. Mr. Mackenzie visited Melbourne, Sydney and Wagga Wagga, and up to a certain time was singularly successful in tracing backwards the career of Thomas Castro. He discovered that, some months before the Dowager's advertisement for her son had appeared, and Mr. Gibbs' client had set up his claim, the slaughterman of Wagga Wagga had married an Irish servant girl named Bryant, who had signed the marriage register with a cross. He also found that the marriage was celebrated, not by a Roman Catholic priest, but by a Wesleyan minister. Searching further, he found out that immediately after the date of the arrival of a letter from the Dowager, informing Mr. Gibbs that her son was a Roman Catholic, Thomas Castro and Mary Ann Bryant had again gone through the ceremony of marriage in those names, and on this occasion the wedding was celebrated in a Roman Catholic chapel. By applying to Mr. Gibbs, Mr. Mackenzie then discovered that the claimant, before leaving Australia, had given instructions for a will, which was subsequently drawn up and executed by him, in which he pretended to dispose of the Tichborne estates, and described properties in various counties, all of which were purely fictitious. The Tichborne family had not and never had any such estates as were there elaborately set forth, nor did any such estates exist, and the will contained no bequest, nor indeed any 295 allusion to a solitary member of Roger's family, except his mother, whom it described as Lady Hannah Frances Tichborne, though her Christian names were in fact Henriette Felicite. Mr. Gibbs explained that it was the knowledge which this document seemed to display of the Tichborne estates and family which induced him to advance money, and that the Dowager Lady Tichborne's letters being merely signed H.F. Tichborne, he had inserted the Christian names Hannah Frances on the authority of his client. Lastly, Mr. Mackenzie learnt that there had been a butcher in Wagga Wagga named Scottler, and that Higgins's slaughterman known as Tom Castro had once told someone that he had known Scottler's family and lived very near their house when he was a boy. Scottler had disappeared, but he was believed to have originally come from London. This information was slight, but it appeared to the shrewd Mr. Mackenzie to be valuable. If the Scottlers were known to Tom Castro as neighbours when he was a boy in London, it would seem to be only necessary to find the Scottler family in order to discover who the claimant to the Tichborne estates really was. After much trouble, though Scottler was not discovered, a clue was found. The solicitor to the defendants in the Chancery suits obtained old directories of London and discovered that there was one Scottler who had kept a public house called the Ship and Punchbowl in High Street, Wapping. In that direction, therefore, inquiries were instituted. The Scottlers had, it was found, gone and left no trace, but it was easy to instruct a detective to inquire after old neighbours, to show them a portrait of the claimant, and to ask if anyone in that locality recognised the features. At last the man prosecuting inquiries found himself in the Globe public house in Wapping, the landlady of which hostelry at once declared the carte de visite to be a portrait of a mysterious individual of huge bulk, who had visited her on the night of the previous Christmas Day, stayed an hour in her parlour, and made numerous inquiries after old inhabitants of Wapping. His inquiries included the Scottlers, and he had particularly wanted 296, the address of the family of the late Mr. George ORTON, a butcher in the High Street, who answered the description of an old neighbour of the Scottlers. The Christmas Day referred to was the very day of the claimant's arrival in England, and the landlady of the Globe was positive that the portrait represented her visitor, whoever he might have been. Moreover, she informed the gentleman that, struck by his inquiries after the Ortons, she had scanned her mysterious visitor's features closely, and observed, "Why, you must be an Orton, you are very like the old gentleman." 3 daughters of old George Orton were then applied to, but they declared that the portrait had no resemblance to any brother of theirs. Neighbours, however, had perceived that these persons, who had been extremely poor, had suddenly shown signs of greatly improved circumstances. Further inquiry led to the discovery that they had a brother named Charles, a humpbacked man, who had been a butcher in a small way, in partnership with a Mr. Woodgate in Hermitage Street, Wapping. He had recently dissolved partnership rather suddenly, but he had previously confided to Mr. Woodgate the curious information that he had a brother just come home from Australia, who was entitled to great property, and who had promised him an allowance of £5 a month, and £2,000 when he got his estates. When, after some trouble, Charles Aughton was discovered, he showed signs of being disposed to explain the mystery, if the solicitors would promptly make it worth his while. But in the very midst of the inquiry, he suddenly vanished from the neighbourhood, and for a long while all trace of him was lost. Meanwhile, the claimant had, by some mysterious means, become aware that these inquiries were in progress, for he wrote at this period to his confidential friend Ruse, the landlord of the Swan, as follows: "We find the other side very busy with another pair of sisters for me. They say I was born in Wapping. I never remember having been there, but Mr. Holmes tell me at a very respectable part of London." Shortly afterwards, 2 out of the 3 daughters of old Mr. Aughton made affidavit 297 that the claimant was not their brother, nor any relation of theirs. The other sister and Charles Aughton, however, made no affidavit. 4 years later, the claimant confessed that he was, after all, the mysterious visitor at the Globe public house on that Christmas Eve, that he shortly afterwards entered into secret correspondence and transactions with the Aughton family, that he gave the sisters money whenever they wrote to say they were in want of any, and that after the period when Charles Aughton was solicited to give information to the other side, he allowed him £5 a month, Charles Aughton, who was then in concealment, being addressed in their correspondence by the assumed name of Brand. The claimant's explanation of these relations with the Aughton family, which he at first denied, was that their brother Arthur Aughton had been a great friend of his for many years, and in various parts of Australia, and that hence he was desirous of assisting his family. At one time he said that his object was to ascertain if his friend Arthur Aughton had arrived in England. At another he stated on oath that when he sailed from Australia he left Arthur Aughton there. The solicitors for the defendants in the Chancery suit, however, did not hesitate to declare their conviction that the pretended Roger Tichborne was no other than Arthur Aughton, youngest son of the late George Aughton, butcher, of High Street, Wapping, that his visit to Wapping on the very night of his arrival was prompted by curiosity to know the position of his family, of whom he had not heard for some years, and that his stealthy transactions with the 3 sisters, and with the brother of Arthur Aughton, had no object but that of furnishing them with an inducement to keep the dangerous secret of his true name and origin. While all these discoveries were being made, the poor old lady went to live for a time with her supposed son at Croydon, but even she could not manage to stay in the extraordinary household, and after a time, though still strong, despite the advice of her best friends, that the huge impostor was her son, she left, and gradually becoming weaker and weaker in body as well as mind, she was, 298 on the 12th of March 1868, found by a servant dead in a chair, and with no relative or friend at hand, in a hotel near Portman Square, where she had sought and found a shelter. Amidst much that was vague in the claimant's account of his past life, there were, at all events, 2 statements of a precise and definite character. These were, first, that he had been at Melipilla in Chile, and had there known intimately a man named Thomas Castro, whose name he had afterwards assumed, and secondly that in 1854 he had been engaged as herdsman to Mr. William Foster, of Boystill, in Gippsland, Australia. If he were an impostor, these statements were undoubtedly imprudent, but they served the purpose of establishing the identity of his career with that of the man whom he claimed to be, for Roger Tichborne had undoubtedly travelled in Chile, and according at least to the tramping sailor's story, embodied in the Dowager's advertisement, he had been carried thence to Australia. The importance attached by his supporters to these apparent tokens of identity sufficiently explains the claimant's explicitness on these points. Melipilla is a long way off, and Boystill is still further. It may have been supposed that witnesses could not be brought from so far, but vast interests were at stake, and the defendant in the Chancery suit speedily applied for commissions to go out to South America and Australia to collect information regarding the claimant's past history. The proposition was strenuously opposed as vexatious, and designed merely to create delay, but the court granted the application. Then the claimant asked for an adjournment, on the ground that he intended to go out and confront the Melipilla folks, including his intimate friend Don Thomas Castro, before the commission, and also to accompany it to Australia. The postponement was granted, a large sum was raised to defray his expenses, and he finally started with the commission, accompanied by counsel and solicitors, bound for Valparaiso and Melipilla, and finally for Victoria and New South Wales. When the vessel, however, arrived at Rio, the claimant went ashore, declaring that he 299 preferred to go thence to Melipilla overland, but he never presented himself at that place, and finally the commission proceeded to examine witnesses and to record their testimony, which thus became part of the evidence in the suit. The claimant had, in fact, re-embarked at Rio for England, having abandoned the whole project, for which strange conduct he made various and conflicting excuses. Even before he had started, circumstances had occurred which had induced some of his supporters to express doubts whether he would ever go to Melipilla. When the commission had become inevitable, the claimant had written a letter to his esteemed friend, Don Tomás Castro, reminding him of past acquaintance in 1853, sending kind remembrances to a number of friends, and altogether mentioning at least 16 persons with Spanish names whom he had known there. The purpose of the letter was to inform Don Tomás that he had returned to England, was claiming magnificent lands, and in brief to prepare his old acquaintances to befriend him there. This letter was answered by Castro through his son Pedro, with numerous good wishes and much gossip about Melipilla and what had become of the old circle. But to the astonishment and dismay of the claimant's attorney, Mr. Holmes, Pedro Castro reminded his old correspondent that when among them he had gone by the name of Arthur Orton. A Melipilla lady named Ahumada then sent a portion of a lock of hair which the claimant acknowledged as his own hair, and thanked her for, but this lady declared that she had cut the lock from the head of an English lad named Arthur Orton, and the claimant thereupon said that he must have been mistaken in thanking her and acknowledging it as his. In the town of Melipilla, 60 or 70 miles inland from Valparaiso, every one of the 16 or 17 persons mentioned by the claimant as old acquaintances, except those who were dead or gone away, came before the commission and were examined. They proved to have substantially but one tale to tell. They said they never knew anyone of the name of Tichborne. Melipilla is a remote little town far off the great high road, and the only 300 English person, except an English doctor, there established who had ever sojourned there, was a sailor lad who, not in 1853, but in 1849 came to them destitute, was kindly treated, picked up Spanish enough to converse in an illiterate way, said his name was Arthur and was always called Arthur by them, declared his father was a butcher named Orton who served the Queen, and said he had been sent to sea to cure St. Vitus's dance, but had been ill-used by the captain, and ran away from his ship at Valparaiso. This lad, they stated, sojourned in Melipilla 18 months, and finally went back to Valparaiso and re-embarked for England. Don Tomás Castro, the doctor's wife, and others, declared they recognized the features of this lad in the portrait of the claimant, and being shown 2 daguerreotype portraits of Roger Tichborne, taken in Chile when he was there, said that the features were not like those of any person they had ever known. Searches were then made in the records of the consul's office at Valparaiso, from which it resulted that a sailor named Arthur Orton did desert from the English ship Ocean in that port at the very date mentioned, and did re-embark, though under the name of Joseph 1000. Orton, about 18 months later. To Boisdale in Australia the commission then repaired, and though this is many thousands of miles from South America, but here similar discoveries were made. Mr. William Foster, the extensive cattle farmer, was dead, but the widow still managed his large property. In reference to the claimant's statement that in July 1854, the very day after he was landed by the vessel which he believed was named the Osprey, at Melbourne, he was engaged by Mr. William Foster and went with him at once to Gippsland, under the assumed name of Thomas Castro, the lady declared that her husband did not settle at Boisdale or have anything to do with that property till 2 years later than that date, and that they never had any herdsman named Thomas Castro. The ledgers and other account books of Mr. Foster were then examined, but no mention of any Castro, either in 1854-301 or at any other time, could be found. On the other hand, there were numerous entries, extending over the 2 years 1857 and 1858, of wages paid and rations served out to a herdsman named Arthur Orton, whom the lady perfectly well remembered, and who had come to them from Hobart Town. All these discoveries were confirmed by the registers of shipping, which showed that Arthur Orton embarked for Valparaiso in 1848, re-embarked for London in 1851, and sailed again for Hobart Town in the following year. But there were other significant circumstances. The ship in which Arthur Orton had returned from Valparaiso was called the Jessie Miller, which was the very name which the claimant in his solemn declaration, prepared by Mr. Gibbs, gave as the name of the vessel in which he came out to Australia. In the same document he had stated the date of his sailing from England as the 28th of November, 1852, and this was now discovered to be the very day, month, and year on which Arthur Orton embarked in the vessel bound for Hobart Town. Mr. Foster's widow had specimens of Arthur Orton's writing and other mementos of his 2 years' service among them, and she unhesitatingly identified a portrait of the claimant as that of the same man. Among other witnesses, a farmer named Hopwood deposed that he had known Arthur Orton at Boysdale under that name, and again at Wagga Wagga under his assumed name of Thomas Castro. At Wagga Wagga the will executed by the claimant, and already referred to, was produced, and it was found that amidst all its fictitious names and imaginary Tichborne estates, it appointed as trustees 2 gentlemen residing in Dorsetshire, England, who have since been discovered to have been intimate friends of old Mr. Orton, the butcher. The testimony on the claimant's behalf before the commission threw but little light. It consisted chiefly of vague stories of his having spoken when in Australia of being entitled to large possessions, and of having been an officer in the army, and stationed in Ireland. Such testimony could, of course, have little weight against the statements of the claimant in writing, 302 made just before embarking at Sydney, with a view of satisfying capitalists of his identity, and betraying total ignorance of Roger Tichborne's military life. While these exposures were being made abroad, matters at home began to look very bad for the claimant. Charles Orton, the brother of Arthur, called upon the solicitors for the other side, and volunteered to give information in the presence of Lord Arundel and other witnesses. This man then stated that the claimant of the Tichborne estates was his brother Arthur, that he had been induced by him to change his name to Brand, and to remain in concealment, that in return the claimant had allowed him £5 per month, but that, since his departure for Chile, the allowance had ceased. Letters of Charles Orton to the claimant's wife, asking whether Sir Roger Tichborne, before he went away, left anything for a party of the name of Brand, have been found and published, and this same Charles has, since the conviction of the claimant, put forth a statement of the whole matter so far as he was concerned. Under these circumstances Mr. Holmes withdrew from the case, and the county gentlemen who, relying in great measure on Lady Tichborne's recognition and the numerous affidavits that had been made, had supported the claimant, held a meeting at the Swan at Alresford, at which, among other documents, certain mysterious letters to the Orton sisters were produced. These letters were signed W.H. Stevens, and they contained inquiries after the Orton family, and also after Miss Mary Ann Loder, who was an old sweetheart of Arthur Orton's, long resident in Wapping. They enclosed as portraits of Arthur Orton's wife and child, certain photographic likenesses which were clearly portraits of the claimant's wife and child, and though they purported to be written by W.H. Stevens, a friend of Arthur Orton's just arrived from Australia, it was suspected that the letters, which were evidently in a feigned hand, were really written by the claimant. They manifested that desire for information about Wapping folks, and particularly the Ortons, which the claimant was known to have exhibited on more 303 occasions than one, and they indicated a wish to get this information by a ruse, and without permitting the writer to be seen. But the correspondence showed that the sisters of Orton had discovered, or at least believed that they had discovered, that the writer was in truth their brother Arthur. The claimant, however, being called in and questioned, solemnly affirmed that the letters were forgeries, designed by his enemies to ruin his cause. Nor was it until he was pressed in cross-examination, 3 years later, that he reluctantly confessed that his charges of forgery were false, and that in fact he and no one else had written the Stevens letters. The claimant's solemn assurances did not convince all his supporters at the meeting at the Swan, but they satisfied some, and funds were still found for prosecuting the Chancery, and next the great common lawsuit, which was technically an action for the purpose of ejecting Carl Lushington from Tichborne House, which had been let to him. Carl Lushington was then a supporter of the claimant, and had not the least objection to be ejected, but the action at once raised the question whether the claimant had a right to eject him. Of course that depended on whether he was or was not the young man who was so long believed to have perished in the Bella. And accordingly this was the issue that the jury had to try on Thursday, the 11th of May, 1871, that Sergeant Ballantyne rose to address the jury on behalf of the claimant, and it was not until the 6th of March, 1872, that the trial was concluded, the proceedings having extended to 103 days. On both sides a large number of witnesses were examined, many being persons of respectability, while some were of high station. The military witnesses for the claimant were very numerous, and among them were 5 of Roger Tichborne's old brother officers, the rest being sergeants, corporals and privates. There were Australian witnesses and medical witnesses, old servants, tenants of the Tichborne family, and numerous other persons. With the exception of 2 remote connections, however, no members of the numerous families of Tichborne and Seymour presented themselves to 304 support the plaintiff's claims, and even the 2 gentlemen referred to admitted that their acquaintance with Roger was slight, and that it was in his youth, and finally, that they had not recognized the features of the claimant, but had merely inferred his identity from some circumstances he had been able to mention. The plaintiff's case was almost entirely unsupported by documentary evidence, and rested chiefly on the impressions or the memory of witnesses, or on their conclusions drawn from circumstances, which often, when they were inquired into in cross-examination, proved to be altogether insufficient. But the cross-examination of the claimant himself was really the turning point of the trial. It extended over 27 days, and embraced the whole history of Roger Tichborne's life, his alleged rescue, the life in Australia, and all subsequent proceedings. Besides this, matters connected with the ORTON case were inquired into. Much that was calculated to alarm supporters of the claimant was elicited. He was compelled to admit that he had no confirmation to offer of his strange story of the rescue, and that he could produce no survivor of the Osprey, nor any one of the crew of the Bella, alleged to have been rescued with him. The mere existence of such a vessel was not evidenced by any shipping register or gazette, or custom house record. It was moreover admitted that he had changed his story, had for a whole year given up the Osprey, and said the vessel was the Themis, and finally returned to the Osprey again. All the strange circumstances of the Wagga Wagga will, the Gibbs and Cubitt correspondence, the furtive transactions with the ORTON family, the curious revelations of the commissions in South America and Australia, were acknowledged and either left unexplained or explained in a way which was evasive, inconsistent, and contradictory. His accounts of his relations with Arthur ORTON were also vague, and his attempts to support his assertion that Castro and ORTON were not one and the same, but different persons, were unsatisfactory. While by his own confession his habitual associates in Australia had been highway robbers and other persons of 305, the vilest class. With regard to his life in Paris, he admitted that his mind was a blank, and he confessed that he could not read a line of Roger Tichborne's letters in French. He gave answers which evidenced gross ignorance on all the matters which Roger's letters and other evidence showed that he had studied. He said he did not think Euclid was connected with mathematics, though Roger had passed an examination in Euclid, and that he believed that a copy of Virgil handed to him was Greek, which it doubtless was to him. He was compelled again and again to admit that statements he had deliberately made were absolutely false. When questioned with regard to that most impressive of all episodes in Roger's life, his love for his cousin, now Lady Ratcliffe, he showed himself unacquainted not merely with precise dates, but with the broad outline of the story and the order of events. His answers on these matters were again confused, and wholly irreconcilable, yet the Solicitor General persisting for good reasons in interrogating him on the slanderous story of the sealed packet, he was compelled to repeat in court, though with considerable variations, what he had long ago caused to be bruited abroad. She was not then Lady Ratcliffe by her own wish, sat in court beside her husband, confronting the false witness, and they had the satisfaction of hearing him convicted, out of his own mouth, and by the damnatory evidence of documents of undisputed authenticity, of a deliberate series of abominable inventions. It was during the course of this trial that the pocketbook left behind by the claimant at Wagga Wagga was brought to England. It was found to contain what appeared to be early attempts at Tichborne signatures, in the form Roger Charles Tichborne, besides such entries as R100. T. BART, Tichborne Hall, Surrey, England, GB, and among other curious memoranda in the claimant's handwriting was the name and address, in full, of Arthur ORTON's old sweetheart, at Wapping, the respectable place of which he had assured his supporters in England that he had not the slightest knowledge. The exposure of Mr. Bagent's unscrupulous 306 partisanship by Mr. Hawkins, and the address to the jury by Sir John Coleridge, followed in due course, and then a few family witnesses including Lady Ratcliffe were heard, who deposed among many other matters to the famous tattoo marks on Roger's arm. And finally, the jury declared that they were satisfied. Then the claimant's advisers, to avoid the inevitable verdict for their opponents, elected to be non-suit. But notwithstanding these tactics, Lord Chief Justice Boville, under his warrant, immediately committed the claimant to Newgate, on a charge of wilful and corrupt perjury. Those who fondly hoped that the great Tichborne imposture had now forever broken down, and that the last in public had been seen of the perjured villain, were mistaken, as after a few weeks in Newgate, the claimant was released on bail in the sum of £10,000, his sureties being Earl Rivers, Mr. Guildford Onslow, 1,000, P. Mr. Whalley, 1,000, P. and Mr. Albernate Wood, a medical man residing at Bayswater. Now began that systematic agitation on the claimant's behalf, and those public appeals for subscriptions, which were so remarkable a feature of the 13 months interval between the civil and the criminal trial. The Tichborne romance, as it was called, had made the name of the claimant famous, and sightseers throughout the kingdom were anxious to get a glimpse of Sir Roger. It was true his case had entirely broken down, but the multitude was struck by the fact that he could still appear on platforms with excitable members of Parliament to speak for him, and could even find a lord to be his surety. It was not everyone who, in reading the long cross-examination of the claimant, had been able to see the significance of the admissions which he was compelled to make, and owing to the claimant's counsel stopping the case on the hint of the jury, the other side of the story had really not been heard, and this fact was made an argument in the claimant's favour. Meanwhile, the propagandism continued until there was hardly a town in the kingdom in which Sir Roger Charles Tichborne, BART, had not appeared on platforms and addressed crowded meetings, while Mr. Guildford Onslow 307 and Mr. Whalley were generally present to deliver foolish and inflammatory harangues. At theatres and music halls, at pigeon matches and open-air fêtes, the claimant was perseveringly exhibited, and while the other side preserved a decorous silence, the public never ceased to hear the tale of his imaginary wrongs. The Tichborne Gazette, the sole function of which was to excite the public mind still further, appeared, and the newspapers contained long lists of subscribers to the Tichborne Defence Fund. This unexampled system of creating prejudice with regard to a great trial still pending was permitted to continue long after the criminal trial had commenced. There had been proceedings, it is true, for contempt against the claimant and his supporters, Mr. Onslow, Mr. Whalley, and Mr. Skipworth, and fine and imprisonment were inflicted, but the agitation continued, violent attacks were made upon witnesses, and even upon the judges then engaged in trying the case, and at length the court was compelled peremptorily to forbid all appearances of the claimant at public meetings. The great trial at bar, presided over by Sir Alexander Cockburn, Lord Chief Justice of the Queen's Bench, Mr. Justice Mellor and Mr. Justice Lush, commenced on the 23rd of April, 1873, and ended on the 28th of February, 1874, a period of a little over 10 months. On the side of the prosecution, 212 witnesses gave their testimony, but the documentary evidence, including the enormous mass of Roger Tichborne's letters, so valuable as exhibiting the character, the pursuits, the thoughts and feelings of the writer, was scarcely less important. The entire Tichborne and Seymour families may be said to have given their testimony against the defendant. Lady Doughty had passed away from the troubled scene since the date of the last trial, but she had been examined and cross-examined on her deathbed, and had then repeated the evidence which she gave on the previous occasion, and declared that the claimant was an impostor. Lady Ratcliffe again appeared in the witness box, and told her simple story, confirmed as it was in all important particulars by the correspondence and other records. Old Paris' 308 friends and acquaintances were unanimous. Father Lefevre and the venerable Absales, Chatelain the tutor and his wife, and numerous others, declared this man was not Roger Tichborne, and exposed his ignorance both of them and their past transactions. When questioned, the defendant had sworn that his father never had a servant named Garsine, but the letters of Sir James were shown to contain numerous allusions to my faithful Garsine, and Garsine himself came into the witness box and told how he had known Roger Tichborne from the cradle to his boyhood, and from his boyhood to the very hour of his going on his travels. On the ORTON question, nearly 50 witnesses declared their conviction that the defendant sitting then before them was the butcher's son whom they had known in Wapping. The witnesses from Australia and from South America unhesitatingly identified the defendant with ORTON, but it is more important to observe that their testimony was supported by records and documents of various kinds, including the ledgers of Mr. Foster of Boysdale, letters under the defendant's own hand, and writings which, it could not be denied, were from the hand of Arthur Orton. On the other side, the witnesses were still more numerous. They included a great number of persons from Wapping, who swore they did not recognise in the defendant the lad whom they had known as Arthur Orton. Many others swore they had known both Orton and the defendant in Australia, and that they were different persons, but their stories were irreconcilable with each other, and were moreover in direct conflict with the statements of the claimant on oath, while several of these witnesses were persons of proved bad character and unworthy of belief. Great numbers of carabineers declared that the defendant was exactly like their old officer, but while 10 officers of that regiment appeared for the prosecution and positively affirmed that the defendant was not Roger Tichborne, only 2 officers gave testimony on the other side, and even these admitted that they had doubts. 8 years had elapsed since Mr. Gibbs fancied he had discovered Sir Roger at 309 Wagga Wagga, but still no Arthur Orton was forthcoming, nor did the sisters of Orton venture to come forward on behalf of the man who had been compelled to admit having taken them into his pay. Not only was the claimant's story of his wreck and rescue shown to be absurd and impossible, but it was unsupported by any evidence, except vague recollections of witnesses having seen an osprey and some shipwrecked sailors at Melbourne in July 1854, and it was admitted that if their tale were true, the phantom vessel and the fact of its picking up 9 precious lives must have escaped the notice of Lloyd's agents, of Custom House officers, and of the Australian newspapers. More, the claimant's osprey must have escaped the notice of such authorities in every port which she had entered from the day that she was launched. So indeed the matter stood until the witness Louis, the pretended steward of the osprey, swore to his strange story, as well as to the defendant's recognition of him by name as an old friend. The Louis episode, terminating in the identification of that infamous witness as an habitual criminal and convict named Lundgren, only recently released on a ticket of leave, together with the complete disproof of his elaborate osprey story, is familiar to the public. It was a significant fact that other witnesses for the defense were admitted to be associates of this rascal, while one of the most conspicuous of all, a man calling himself Captain Brown, had pretended to corroborate portions of Louis's evidence which are now proved to be false. Some allowance may perhaps be made in the defendant's favour for the singularly unskilful and damaging character of his counsel Dr. Kenealy's 2 addresses to the jury, which occupied no less than 43 entire days. This barrister not only made violent personal attacks on every witness of importance for the prosecution, without, as the judges observed, any shadow of foundation, but he assailed his own client with a vehemence and a persistence which are without parallel in the case of an advocate defending a person against a charge of perjury. He gave up statements of the 310 defendant at almost every period of his extraordinary story as false, declared them to be moonshine, expressed his conviction that no sensible person could for a moment believe them, acknowledged that to attempt to verify them in the face of the evidence, or even to reconcile them with each other, would be hopeless, set some down as errant nonsense, denounced others as Munchausenisms, and recommended the jury not to believe them with a heartiness which would have been perfectly natural in the mouth of Mr. Hawkins, but which, coming from counsel for the defence, was, as one of the learned judges remarked, strange indeed. But the doctrine of the learned gentleman was that the very extent of the perjury should be his client's protection, because it showed that he was not a man to be tried by ordinary standards. When, in addition to this, he laboured day after day to persuade the jury that Roger Tichborne was a drunkard, a liar, a fool, an undutiful son, an ungrateful friend, and an abandoned libertine, declared in loud and impassioned tones that he would strip this jay of his borrowed plumes, and indignantly repudiated the notion that the man his client claimed to be had one single good quality about him, the humour of the situation may be said to have reached its climax. Yet Dr. Kenealy at least proved his sincerity by not only insinuating charges against the gentleman who disappeared with the Bella, but by actually calling witnesses to contradict point-blank statements of his own client, which lay at the very foundation of the charges of perjury against him. There were, it is true, many unthinking persons of the kind that mistake sound for sense, who considered Dr. Kenealy a vastly clever fellow. If he be so, then the world in general and the constitution of the English bar in particular are wrong, but anyhow one thing is certain, that the counsel damaged the case materially, and showed himself eminently unfitted for the position of leader. Mr. Hawkins' powerful address quickly disposed of Dr. Kenealy and his crotchets. The inquiry was raised into a calmer height when the Lord Chief Justice commenced his memorable summing up, going minutely through the vast 311 mass of testimony, depicting the true character of Roger Tichborne from the rich mine of materials before him, contrasting it with that of the defendant as shown by the evidence, and while giving due weight to the testimony in his favour, exposing hundreds of examples of the falsity of his statements made upon oath. The verdict of guilty had been anticipated by all who paid attention to the evidence. The foreman publicly declared that there was no doubt in the mind of any juryman that the man who has for 8 years assumed the name and title of the gentleman whose unhappy story is recorded in these pages is an impostor who has added slander of the wickedest kind to his many other crimes. But not only were they satisfied of this, they were equally agreed as to his being Arthur Orton. The sentence of 14 years penal servitude followed, and was assuredly not too heavy a punishment for offences so enormous, Yet there are others still at large, who, having aided the impostor with advice and money, should not be allowed to escape, while the more clumsy scoundrel suffers the award of detected infamy. Thus ended the great Tichborne impersonation case, the most remarkable feature in which was, not that a rude ignorant butcher should proclaim himself a baronet, but that thousands of persons sane in every other respect should have gone crazy about him, and should, despite the evidence given, sufficient many hundreds of times told, or for any reasonable being, even now persist that Roger Tichborne still lives, and is the victim of a gross conspiracy. What need is there to point out the idiocy of such ravings? What necessity ever to contradict statements which contradict themselves?